Welcome back to The Urban Ascetic. In his book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, a famous psychologist, he connects the exposure of screen time at an early age to an entire generation of Gen Zs and young working adults that is today plagued with a deep, underlying sense of anxiety. But when it comes to the problems of modern parenting, this anxiety is just the tip of the iceberg. Many of the parents I know are practicing habits or not practicing them and instead defaulting to their own whims and fancies when it comes to parenting, and doing so in a way that is detrimentally harmful for their children and their long-term development and their family dynamics. And this is the case even with Christian parents whom we generally feel would be thoughtful about the ways in which they parent their children. But that's not the case. Why is this, and how have we gotten ourselves here? In today's video, I run through several examples that I've encountered over the years and discuss how we've gotten ourselves into this space as a culture on a whole, as well as provide a glimpse of what I believe to be a solution moving forward. And this is a topic that I get really excited about because every time I think about it, it gets me really angry. So let's dive right in. Let me run through several examples, so that you understand exactly what I mean when I talk about the problems with modern parenting. Right, so I was recently at a dinner. This was quite a luxurious restaurant, $30 to $40 per meal, with high IQ students and their parents. Right, and towards the end of the meal, one of the child, I think it was an 8-year-old boy, went up to this pool table, which was like brand new, pristine, with all the heavy, solid pool balls, and started throwing the pool balls on the table. Now, bear in mind, this was quite an upscale, posh restaurant, right? There was marble flooring, full height glass windows, and everyone started to get very uncomfortable, right? So he was throwing, and eventually a waiter came and told him, no, you can't do that. And the mother sort of said, no, please stop this. And the child completely ignored the mother. He just continued throwing, some balls fell on the ground, everyone was very squirmy and uncomfortable, and the mother was still there, no, don't do this. Right, so the child completely ignored the mom whatsoever. What is going on? Now, in my second example, this is from a friend. You might have heard this in some of my other videos. She's a teacher at a secondary school, a high social economic standard, SES, S-E-S, school, which just means that the parents are richer. Right? And she has taught at this high SES school of secondary school students, 13 to 16 years old, as well as another lower SES school in the past. So I asked her, what's the difference between the high and low SES and the children? And she says there are two differences. The first is that the children in the high SES school, they don't actually pay attention in class because the parents have paid for tuition classes outside of school, and because they only pay like $24 a month for their regular schooling, the children therefore ascribe worth and value to these outside tuition classes and see no point in paying attention to the regular classes which my friend teaches. That's the first thing. The second thing is that whenever she buys a present or a gift for the class or the children from the high SES school will say, "Che, why you buy this for me? I already have leh." And so they're not appreciative. Whereas the children from the low SES school, because they don't receive so much gifts, they will generally be a lot more appreciative. And she's told me that she actually prefers teaching in a low SES school because the children are more human. What is going on? In this third example, this is from a parenting coach that I have studied under. She's about in her 50s, she's really wise and experienced, and she developed a set of worldview framework materials to guide parents to help their teenagers process their own worldview and sense of identity in their coming of age years as they become young adults. So this is for parents, and the response and feedback from the parents is really, really telling. So the parents basically said, look, this worldview material is wonderful, but I don't have the time to attend your classes. Do you have a student version for my child to attend? And during the school holidays, I will attend and pay whatever it is. So you see, the parents essentially don't want and are not willing to fork out the time to get trained to guide their children, but they're more than happy to throw money and their children's time for them to learn this material themselves. That is the dynamic of our modern parenting today. What is going on? And in this last example, it's a little more painful for me because it's a close friend of mine, right? And so, husband and wife, they have a child close to 2 years old, Since young, the child has been very, very light weight-wise, so 1 percentile weight, and therefore encountering and at risk of developmental delays. And what they have done as a result is that as the child turned 1 and 2, they have given the child whatever the child wants to eat, and so when they eat at meals, they actually will have food, but they won't touch the food. They'll wait till the child has eaten and picked whatever they want, and then if the child doesn't want that, they'll buy something else, and this will go on, and there'll be leftover foods, and finally the parents will eat that leftover food. Now at first glance you think that this is actually quite a good idea because the child's 1 percentile weight, you just want the child to eat whatever they want. But if you think about it, this lack of the alternative is actually what will truly benefit the child, which is you train the child, have a fixed portion, mama has a portion, papa has a portion, the child has a portion, and the child is required to finish their portion without touching the parent's food. Right, so the child understands boundaries, and at the start this is going to be hell for the child and the parents because everybody's going to scream, the child's going to be angry, not going to cooperate. But over time, the child will actually finish their food, which means the child has a chance to actually gain weight. As compared to if the child just wants to eat whatever they want, and as a result, actually not gain weight and remain at the 1 percentile. Right, so it's without a doubt that these parents love their child to bits. Right? But the issue is with the method. Right? And so whenever I think about it, I actually feel two emotions. One is I feel frustrated, upset, angry. And the second is I feel heartbroken. Now the first is really me coming from a more critical or judgmental view, and that should be tempered with love, certainly. But the second, I just feel really painful for the child and the whole family, right? And I think that's pretty reasonable because in trying to get their child to gain weight, but not understanding the method, in my view, they have actually harmed the child and kept the child and denied the child the opportunity to be trained to finish their food and therefore have a better chance of gaining weight. And this has massive consequences on the entire family unit, not just the child. Right? First, meal times are absolutely painful. The child continues to encounter developmental delays and requires medical intervention for those delays. Right? And the father is very, very stressed out mentally because the child is also very clingy to the mom, which means because they haven't trained the child to be respectful of the father and not scream at the father every time the father takes the child on his own, for instance, when the mom goes out to an event. So the father has had to bear 1 hour of screaming and tantrums from the child because of this similar philosophy. Right? So you see, there's no doubt that parents in Singapore love their children. But because they're not really adhering to the truth or the proper methods with which to parent the children, they end up giving in emotionally to their children's whims and fancies. And it actually hurts the child's well-being, long-term development, and the family unit's well-being and stability and the stress that the parent have towards parenting. Right? So you see, in a way it's the opposite of me. I lead very strongly with truth, but I need love to sort of augment the truth. The parents of modern Singapore, as well as most developed countries around the world, they lead not with love, but with a pandering to their child's whims and fancies, and really what they need is really to augment that with truth. So these are 4 examples that hopefully paint a picture of the problems with modern parenting, at least in Singapore. Right? And now let me go on to try to figure out how we got here culturally. Right? So there are 2 factors. The first is the increased affluence that we have today in general. Now, I'm not saying that the parents spoil their children, although that is the case for some. But even with parents who do not spoil their children, the moment you are more affluent, middle upper class, you have your basic needs met. Let's say your child doesn't want to eat a certain meal. The option of buying a second meal is now available to you because you are more affluent. Whereas if you are poor, you actually don't have the option. You just eat, if not you don't eat, up to you. Okay? And therefore the circumstance shapes the training and formation of the child. So this is a very interesting dynamic. In general, with poorer families, they have less access to parenting knowledge and best practices, and therefore their parenting is generally poorer in quality. Not because they love their children less, but because they just have less exposure or time for these resources because they're always working, right? So you would say that the poorer families, their parenting skills may not be as good as the richer families. However, the richer families, their circumstance actually leads to situations whereby their parenting is generally poorer because Not because they are bad parents, but because just by virtue of having more money and having more options to spoil the children. Okay, so that's the first thing. But it's not just affluence. The second major factor that affects our parenting today is this idea of double income. Right? So single income or double income, whether one parent works or not, is an entire video I will devote on its own. It's a deeply cultural, embedded in our psyche kind of topic. But essentially, because both parents work, you have very, very little time and you have a lot of money, right, to splurge on holidays, so on and so forth. And this has led to the very weird concept of quality time. Now, quality time is something that we use and take for granted today. But if you just think through, what is the single most important thing in a relationship? Is it relationship, or is it the limited time that I have? And with quality time, essentially, you are saying that because I have limited time, I need to maximize the efficiency of the time that I spend with you, my child, or my parent, or my spouse. And therefore, I need to do quality time. But the reality is that in any relationship, you'll be taking your dad to the hospital, you need to wait for him, there'll be times you argue with your child, so on and so forth. And would you say all of this is quality time? By the standards of how people define quality time today? No. Right? So quality time is a nonsense concept that takes time as the most important factor, not the relationship itself. And letting the time that you spend with the person be ordered around the relationship and how the person is doing, whether the person is sick, so on and so forth. Right? So quality time is a myth, and is a very, very bad myth that is partially caused by this idea of double income, more money, less time. Okay? The second cultural reason, I think, of how we got here is this. Okay, so you think about it, affluence and double income actually doesn't necessarily lead to poor parenting. Because in many other countries around the world, I have a friend in Australia, from Australia, and I have friends who have lived in Australia, and they tell me that the parenting there is a lot more parent and family-centric than child-centric, right? So I was thinking, why? Australia is also pretty rich, right? It can't be just money. And so I think the second issue is this sinful stronghold of academia and grades and success that is prescribed in Singapore, and therefore parents pour all their resources into this aspect. Right? And it leads to issues with how they parent, their goals for their children, and the stress that it causes them. Right? This is in contrast to a more holistic, varied definition of success, for example, in Australia, which generally leads to more parent and family-centric parenting and really more chill parenting in general. Right? So now let me go on to two common approaches for how parents treat their children today that I see very, very often, but both are flawed in different ways. The first is that the parent thinks that the child knows what is right and they are there to be a friend to their child. Right? So the child doesn't actually do wrong. If they do wrong, they just don't really understand, and I just need to guide them a little bit. Right? So really, I'm their friend as a parent. Right? And the child knows what they want to eat, when they need to sleep, whether or not they should greet their elders and their parents, so on and so forth. We just need to give him time, whatever that means. Right? So the inherent question here is, are we actually broken as children and sinful or not? Chinese culture will tell you that there's training and discipline. Christian culture will tell you that we are inherently born sinful and broken and therefore need not just guidance, but correction. But for some reason, the modern parent doesn't think that at all. Right? So this is a more fundamental philosophical position. And the second disposition is this. I want to train my child. I believe in training and instruction. But you don't understand my child. You don't understand how stubborn, strong-willed, or angry my child can get. And he is a special snowflake. So I cannot train my child in the same way that you may think you train your child or any other child for that matter. You don't understand my child. Right? And so this leads to the abandonment of training, or even if there's training, you just try a little bit and then you give up completely. Right? And so the space to train may be smaller. Like for instance, in my earlier example of my friend whose child is 1% overweight, the space to train is a lot smaller than, let's say, a child of average weight. Right? But the question is there still space to train? Because for most parents, the moment the child has some kind of a hint of an issue, whether it's medical, psychological, emotional, shouting and screaming, whatever, immediately the space to train disappears. And that you don't understand my child. This sentiment is like so prevalent. Okay? Now, in contrast, my children are average, so please don't compare if your child has some kind of deficiency or issue or medical issue. But my children are generally quite healthy, and these are some of the metrics that I trained them, which may be quite alarming to parents today, but it's actually a norm 30 or 40 years ago. Right? So by 14 to 16 weeks, both of them are sleeping 7 to 8 hours through the night, and that slowly extends to 12 hours. By 2.5 years old, both of them are out of diapers except for nap time and bedtime at night, and they are fully toilet trained. By 3 to 3.5, they can cycle on their own on a bicycle without the helping wheels. And by 5 years old, my boy can bathe by himself, although I had to train him not to use the entire bottle of shampoo and not to turn on the tap for 10 minutes doing nothing. These are sort of quite reasonable metrics to me, but to most of the parents that I talk to, these are absolutely absurd and it's like downright impossible, right? I'll leave you to figure out why. Now, I think here we have this misunderstanding of the concept of selflessness, right? So if you say sleep training is good for the parent's not going to do it. But if you say sleep training is good for the child and you can prove it with data, the parent's going to do it. Right? But the reality is that sleep training is good for the parent and the child. Right? But because the parents today are so wired to be, sacrificial, I'm going to give up my sleep, I'm going to give this everything, nothing matters except my child's well-being, whims and fancies. Everything is heavily, very geared towards this idea of I'm doing it for my child. But that is a deeply mistaken understanding. And the contrast is to do it actually to be parent-centric and family-centric. Right? So, let me give you certain examples of me training my children that have actually benefited others. Right? So for instance, my boy is able to greet people loud and clearly without prompting, mostly. They understand that they should not be interrupting adult conversations, and when they do so, we remind them and they wait until the conversation ends. And when they attend a new class or meet a new teacher somewhere, they are able to listen and follow instructions. They don't whine or scream when we say goodbye to them, because generally speaking, they are trained to do so at home. So these are all good benefits, right? At least you serve others. So if you want to train, at least you train there. Right? Whether your child train through the night, I'm not going to argue with you on that, because it's a very, very difficult argument for me. Okay? So this brings me to two key fundamental questions I have to ask. And the first, I've covered earlier, is whether inherently our children are broken or not. Now, old Chinese culture will tell you that, the children need to be spanked, they need to be corrected. And Christian culture will tell you that they're born sinful. So, if we believe that our children inherently do wrong, it affects the way in which we teach them and correct them. Right? But if we don't, then naturally, training and instruction and discipline completely goes out of the window. So this is very fundamental. The second is the question of, as parents, are we engineers or are we more closer to shepherds? Now, engineers want to control the entire engineering process, including the quality of the output. But shepherds know that they're given some sheep, and their responsibility is to steward and take care of the sheep as best as they can, but their job is not to turn the sheep into dogs or to control the outcome of what the sheep become. Okay, and most modern parenting is closer to this engineering. We have a timetable, we fill up the child's timetable, and we want to control every single aspect, including their relaxation time. Right? And of course, that leads to a lot of guilt. And some parents even vicariously try to live to their children. Let's say they didn't make it to a certain school. Now they want to drill their children hard through tuition to make it to their school. So that, I don't know what kind of ridiculous mindset is that. So on and so forth. Okay? Now let me go on to the solution, which is really quite simple. It's going back to rules and the enforcement of consequences. Right? Rules has taken a really, really bad rap in the last 20 years or so, but it was always assumed to be a norm in the past, right? So rules today are meant to be broken. If you look at liberalism, right, they're always trying to bypass the rules to encounter new frontiers, whatever that means, right? But just ask a simple question. In a game of football, are you free to enjoy the game because of the rules, or do the rules actually restrict and constrain you? Think about a situation where a striker is about to score a goal, he uses his hands, he throws the balls into the goal. The referee rules there's a goal, everyone celebrates, play resumes as normal. When you follow the rules, we are actually not constraining ourselves, but we are actually free to enjoy life or the game or whatever it is for what it is. Now, with rules, you also want to talk about the enforcement of consequences. Simple example. Let's say there's a new parking regulation that says you cannot park on this road in Singapore. Right? What will happen is that the road users will park there and they will try to observe and say, really, are we going to get caught? But the moment one person gets caught and issues a fine, everybody will talk about it, the word will spread, and immediately nobody's going to do that anymore. Which means that the rules flourish when the consequences are enforced, right? And that is the same in parenting as well, right? When you actually enforce the rules, your children will actually understand and learn what is good and what is not good, right? However, it is important to have rules and consequences without instilling a culture of fear and operating out of anger, right? And this is quite important, right? Because a lot of times when we dish out consequences, we're actually angry as parents. And that just reflects a lack of self-control, self-awareness, and maybe just stress and pressures from other areas, for example, double income. And therefore, we don't have the room or the love or the space to hold for our child, to hold their emotion internally, to absorb that, and actually mete out the punishment or the consequence in a way that is dispassionate and fair. Right? So nowadays, sometimes when I go out, I choose to time out my child. I tell him, when you go back, you need to go for a time out for something they did wrong. And my boy, who's 5, sometimes when I forget, he will come back home and he will actually accept the punishment and remind me that he ought to be punished and go and do his time out quietly without screaming. And most of the time, I'm able to do it in a way that I'm not angry as well. So you see, the point is that children inherently understand rules and the enforcement of consequences, and they are a good thing. Because my boy today, he just understands it, right? It has taken a bit of time, but we are in a good space now, right? However, if we are angry whenever we enforce, it will naturally build a culture of fear and behavior conformity. So the millennials in my generation are generally quite, they don't like how their parents instilled or enforce some of the rules, typically with anger in the past, and therefore they don't want to do this to their children. But unfortunately, they have completely abandoned rules as a result. Right? So the solution is to go back to rules and the enforcement of consequences, but to work on yourself so that you don't instill a culture of fear and you work through your own anger. Right? And over time, the question is this. The child will understand, is it the system that is implementing the law and the rule? Or is it, Papa and Mama is angry, therefore I need to conform? Right? And so, going back to just really rules and consequences is what will solve a lot of issues that I've mentioned today. So that's all I have for today. In my next video, I'll go through something even more fundamental than rules and consequences, which is just a parenting mindset 101. This is a framework that I've designed and I'll work that through, including the consequences and implications culturally. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.